The sun baked the dusty plains of Dry Creek, a small forgotten corner of the Wild West where the wind seemed to whistle secrets through the tumbleweeds. On the outskirts of town stood a sprawling but weathered cattle ranch, surrounded by fences that had seen better days. The owner was a man known simply as Eli McGraw, though most folks in town called him the Giant Loner. At 6'7", with shoulders broad enough to fill a doorway, Eli was a sight to behold. But it wasn't his size that made him a legend. It was the fact that he kept to himself, avoiding human company as if it were a rattlesnake in tall grass. 17 years earlier, Eli had been a young cowboy full of laughter, charm, and a willingness to help anyone in need. But a heartbreak, deep and cutting, had changed him. A woman he loved had left town without a word, and Eli never quite recovered. From that day on, he buried himself in work, speaking only to his cattle, horses, and the occasional trader who came by for beef or milk. His days followed a strict rhythm. Up before dawn, feed the herd, check the fences, milk the cows, then tend to repairs. At night, he'd sit on his porch, hat low over his eyes, watching the sunset with only the distant calls of coyotes for company. The townsfolk whispered about him. Some called him strange, others called him tragic, but no one dared disturb his solitude. That was until one unusually warm spring afternoon. Eli was hauling hay to the barn when he heard the creak of the ranch gate and the sound of light footsteps crunching on gravel. He looked up to see 3 young women, strangers to him, walking toward the barn. They were dressed in modest prairie skirts and sun hats, but there was a spark of boldness in their eyes. Eli straightened, his shadow stretching across the ground like a tower over the trio. "Afternoon," one of them said with a polite nod. "We heard you've got the best dairy cows in Dry Creek. We were wondering, could we learn how to milk them?" Eli blinked, surprised by both the question and their nerve. No one had set foot on his ranch without permission in nearly 2 decades. His instinct told him to refuse. After all, this was his quiet world, untouched by outsiders. But something in their voices, some mixture of sincerity and curiosity, made him hesitate. He set the hay down slowly, eyes narrowing, as the distant lowing of the cows filled the silence. The Giant Loner of Dry Creek had no idea yet, but this unexpected visit was about to pull him back into a life he thought he'd left behind. Eli McGraw stood still for a long moment, the brim of his hat casting a shadow over his weathered face. The 3 young women waited, shuffling slightly under his intense gaze. He wasn't used to strangers lingering on his land, much less asking favors. Finally, he spoke, his voice deep and slow, like gravel sliding down a hill. "You ever milked a cow before?" he asked. The tallest of the 3, a confident-looking brunette, shook her head. "No, sir. We're from the next county over. We're here visiting family in Dry Creek, and, well, someone told us you've got dairy cows worth seeing. We thought maybe you could show us how it's done." Eli's eyes flicked between them. He noticed they weren't giggling like some folks did when they came around to poke fun at his solitary life. They were curious, but respectful. That alone made him soften. Just a little. He stepped aside and motioned toward the barn. "Come on, then. But watch your step. Some of those boards will splinter if you're not careful." The barn smelled of hay, leather, and the faint sweetness of fresh milk. Rays of sunlight filtered through the gaps in the old wooden walls, casting stripes of gold across the dusty floor. Inside, a row of sturdy Jersey cows chewed lazily, their large eyes following the newcomers. Eli picked up a 3-legged stool and set it beside the closest cow. "Her name's Bessie," he said, patting the animal's flank. "She's gentle, but she don't like quick movements. Sit here, keep your hands warm, and don't pull too hard." The women watched as he demonstrated, his large hands surprisingly careful as he worked. Milk streamed into the metal pail with a steady rhythm. When he handed the stool to the first woman, she hesitated, then tried to mimic his movements. The cow flicked her tail, and the woman laughed nervously, nearly spilling the pail. Eli couldn't help but crack the faintest smile, a rare thing for him. "Takes practice," he said, his voice carrying just a hint of warmth. They took turns, each trying their hand at milking under Eli's watchful eye. He offered quiet tips, correcting their grip or telling them when to ease their pull. For the first time in years, his barn was filled with the sound of friendly voices, and it didn't feel so heavy with silence by the time the lesson ended. The sun was dipping lower, painting the plains in shades of orange and rose. The 3 women thanked him sincerely, saying they'd never forget their first time milking a cow. Eli gave a slow nod, watching them walk toward the gate. As they disappeared down the dusty road, Eli felt something strange, a stirring in his chest he hadn't felt in a long time. It wasn't just about the cows. For the first time in 17 years, he realized he didn't entirely mind the idea of company. The next morning, Eli McGraw was already at work before the first light broke over the horizon. The air was cool, carrying the scent of dew and the faint cry of meadowlarks. He moved through his chores with the same steady rhythm as always, feeding the cattle, checking the water troughs, and repairing a section of fence where last night's wind had loosened the posts. It was the kind of work he could do without thinking, his mind usually calm and empty, but today his thoughts kept wandering back to the 3 young women who had visited the day before. Their laughter still echoed faintly in his memory, their genuine curiosity a strange contrast to the long silence he'd grown accustomed to. Eli shook his head and muttered under his breath. They're probably long gone by now. Around mid-morning, as he was stacking fresh hay in the barn, the sound of wagon wheels crunching over the dirt road reached his ears. He turned and, sure enough, saw the same 3 women stepping down from a small, well-worn cart. They were dressed in lighter clothing this time, their hair tied back neatly, and each carried a small basket. Eli straightened, leaning one hand against the barn post. "Didn't figure I'd be seeing you again." The shorter of the 3, a lively woman with chestnut hair, smiled. "We thought we'd bring you something in thanks." She held out a basket covered with a checker cloth. Inside were fresh biscuits, a jar of apple preserves, and a wedge of cheese. Eli hesitated. He wasn't used to receiving gifts, and certainly not from strangers. "That's kind of you," he said gruffly, taking the basket carefully as though it might break. The tall brunette spoke next. "We were hoping you might let us help again. We learned a lot yesterday, and it's not every day you get to work with cows like yours." Eli studied them for a long moment. His first instinct was to refuse. His ranch wasn't a place for social calls. But something inside him, the part that remembered what it was like to talk and share a laugh, overrode his usual caution. "All right," he said finally. "But this time you're not just milking. There's fence work, water hauling, and feed to spread. Ranch life's more than just a stool and a pail." They agreed eagerly, and soon the women were following Eli across the ranch. He showed them how to carry hay without dropping half of it, how to check for loose wire on the fence line, and how to guide the cows toward the milking stalls without spooking them. Their skirts caught dust, and their hands grew sore, but they didn't complain as they worked. Eli found himself talking more than he had in years, explaining little things about the land, the cattle, and even bits of his past. He caught himself smiling once or twice, though he quickly masked it under his hat brim. By the time the sun began its slow slide toward the horizon, the four of them stood side by side, watching the herd graze in the fading light. For Eli, the silence wasn't the heavy, lonely kind anymore. It was the quiet of shared work well done, a sound he realized he'd missed more than he cared to admit. 2 days after their return, Eli McGraw's ranch woke to an uneasy stillness. The usual lowing of the cows was sharper, more restless, and when Eli stepped out onto his porch, he saw why: dust rising in the far pasture. Something had stirred the herd. By the time the three young women arrived in their wagon, Eli was already saddling his horse. "What's wrong?" the brunette asked, glancing toward the grazing fields. "Fence must be down on the north line," Eli replied, tightening the saddle straps. "If it's down, the cattle could wander into the scrubland. Coyotes out there won't do him any favors." Without hesitation, the chestnut-haired woman spoke up. "We'll help. Just tell us what to do." Eli paused, weighing their offer. Fence repair wasn't simple. It meant hauling posts, stretching wire, and hammering under the hot sun. But their determination was clear, and he had to admit, extra hands would make the job faster. "All right, load those posts into the wagon and follow me." The ride out to the fence line was rough. The trail narrowed between patches of mesquite and rocky ground, the wheels of the women's cart bouncing over uneven ruts. When they arrived, the problem was plain as day. A 20-foot section of fence had been flattened, likely by a spooked steer in the night. Fresh hoof prints told the story. One of the larger cows had panicked, hit the fence hard, and taken part of it down. Eli dismounted and knelt to inspect the damage. "Posts are split. We'll have to replace the whole section." Under Eli's instruction, the women carried new cedar posts to the site, digging holes with a heavy post hole digger. Sweat ran down their faces, but no one complained. Eli showed them how to brace the posts so they wouldn't lean under the strain of the wire. Stretching the barbed wire was the hardest part. Eli held the spool steady while the brunette gripped the end with thick gloves, pulling it taut. The chestnut-haired woman fed the wire through while the third kept the post steady. It was slow, tiring work, but together they rebuilt the fence one strand at a time. When it was finally finished, Eli stood back, resting his hands on his hips. "Not bad," he said, glancing at the women. Most men in town couldn't have done it faster. They grinned, brushing dust from their skirts. The sun was setting now, bathing the repaired fence line in warm light. The cattle were already drifting back toward the pasture, safe behind the new barrier on the ride back to the ranch. The air felt lighter. They talked about small things: the weather, the land, and the taste of fresh biscuits. For Eli, it was a strange and welcome feeling. He'd always believed his life was meant to be silent and solitary, but the past few days were proving him wrong. That night, sitting on his porch, Eli realized something unexpected. He was starting to look forward to their visits. 3 days after fixing the north fence, Dry Creek sky carried a strange heaviness. By mid-afternoon, the air was thick, the wind restless, and the clouds rolled in darker than a blacksmith's forge smoke. Eli McGraw had seen this kind of weather before. When the wind picked up from the west and the clouds sank low, trouble wasn't far behind. He was in the barn checking on the feed when the three young women arrived in their wagon. The chestnut-haired one called out, "Eli, the wind's wild today. We thought we'd check in before heading back to town." Eli looked past them at the horizon, where lightning flickered in the distance. "You won't make it back before it hits," he said firmly. "Storm like this'll come down fast. You'd best stay here until it passes." The brunette frowned. "We don't want to trouble you." "It's no trouble," Eli replied, already stepping toward the pasture. "But I'm going to need your help before the rain starts." They followed him to the open range, where the cattle were grazing far from the barn. Storm winds could scatter them, and Eli knew he had only minutes to bring the herd in. He handed each woman a long stick for guiding the cattle. "Stay to their sides, not behind them, and keep talking low. Don't spook them." The first fat raindrops fell as they began driving the herd back. The wind howled through the grass, making the cows uneasy, their ears twitching at every clap of thunder. One young heifer broke away, bolting toward the scrubland. Without hesitation, the blonde among the three sprinted after it, circling wide, just as Eli had shown earlier. With her quick thinking, she turned the heifer back toward the others. By the time they reached the barn, the rain was coming in sheets. Eli swung the big doors open, guiding the herd inside while the women latched the gates. The roof rattled with the force of the storm, and thunder rolled so close it made the ground tremble. Inside the barn, Eli checked each stall, making sure the cattle were secure. The women stood dripping, hair plastered to their faces, their skirts heavy with water. Despite the mess, they were grinning. That, the brunette said between breaths, was the most exciting thing we've done all week. Eli allowed himself a small chuckle. "You all did good. Could have lost half the herd if not for you. The storm raged for hours, trapping them in the barn. They passed the time talking, sharing stories, and laughing at the blonde's retelling of her chase after the runaway heifer. Eli even found himself telling an old tale from his youth, something he hadn't shared in years. When the wind finally eased and the rain slowed to a steady drizzle, the air outside smelled fresh, almost sweet. The damage on the ranch was minimal, thanks to their quick work. That night, as they sat together on the porch, watching the last of the storm clouds drift away, Eli realized the truth he hadn't admitted to himself in 17 years. Maybe he didn't have to live his life alone. After all, about a week after the storm, Eli McGraw decided it was time to head into Dry Creek for supplies. His barrels of flour were running low, and one of his saddles needed repair. Normally, he'd make the trip alone, speaking only to the shopkeepers and blacksmith before riding back to his ranch. But that morning, as he was hitching his wagon, the familiar creak of wheels came up the lane. The three young women arrived, cheerful as ever, carrying a basket of eggs they'd gathered for him. When Eli mentioned he was bound for town, they exchanged quick glances. "We've got business there too," the brunette said. "Mind if we ride along?" Eli hesitative. He wasn't much for parading company in front of the townsfolk, who were already prone to whispering about him. But refusing felt wrong after all the help they'd given. "All right," he said finally. "Climb aboard." The trip to town was easygoing, the wagon rolling over sunlit hills while the women chatted and laughed. Eli mostly listened, though now and then he offered a dry remark that drew smiles. It was strange to him, pleasant but strange, to feel part of a group again. When they rolled into Dry Creek's main street, heads turned. Men outside the saloon paused mid-conversation. Shopkeepers looked up from their work, and a few folks even tipped their hats in a surprise greeting. It wasn't every day the reclusive rancher was seen in public, let alone accompanied by three lively young women. They split up to run errands. Eli to the general store for sacks of flour and coffee, the women to the seamstress and baker. By noon, they met again outside the blacksmith shop, where Eli was paying to have a stirrup strap replaced. That was when a commotion broke out near the livery stable. A riderless horse galloped wildly down the street, reins dragging in the dust. A boy, no more than 10, was chasing after it, shouting, "That's my pa's horse." Eli acted on instinct. Handing his reins to the brunette, he stepped into the road, raised his arms wide, and called low to the panicked animal. Years of working cattle had given him a steady presence, and the horse slowed just enough for him to grab the dangling reins. The animal snorted and danced sideways, but Eli held firm, murmuring until it calmed. The boy ran up, breathless with gratitude. "Thank you, mister. Pa would have been real mad if we lost him." By then, a small crowd had gathered. Folks who'd once whispered about Eli now watched with something like respect. One old ranch hand even clapped him on the shoulder. "Still got the touch, McGraw," he said. The women stood nearby, smiling at the scene. On the ride back, they teased him gently about being the town's unexpected hero. But Eli only shook his head, though there was the faintest hint of pride in his eyes that night. Sitting on his porch with the soft glow of lantern light spilling from the windows, Eli realized something had shifted. The people of Dry Creek no longer saw him as just the giant loner on the edge of town. They'd seen what he could do, and maybe, just maybe, they were starting to remember the man he used to be.
2 days after their trip to town, Eli McGraw was in the barn mending a harness strap when a distant clatter of hooves drew his attention. It wasn't the steady rhythm of ranch work. It was faster, purposeful. A moment later, the Dry Creek post rider pulled up, a dust-covered man with a leather satchel slung over his shoulder. "Got something for you, McGraw," the rider called, handing over an envelope yellowed at the edges. The writing on the front was neat, careful, almost delicate. Eli frowned. He hadn't received a letter in years. Tucking the harness aside, he tore the seal and began to read. The words hit him like a cold wind. "Eli, I don't know if you'll even open this, but I had to write. I'm not coming back to Dry Creek, but there's someone you should know. Your niece, Clara. She's grown now, but she needs a safe place for the summer. I told her you were a good man, and I hope that's still true. She'll be arriving in 2 weeks." The signature at the bottom was from his sister, Ruth, a woman he hadn't spoken to in over a decade. The two had parted on tense terms after she'd left town suddenly, taking her young daughter with her. Now, out of nowhere, she was sending that daughter to his ranch. The sound of approaching voices pulled Eli from his thoughts. The 3 young women had arrived, carrying baskets of fresh bread from town. The chestnut-haired one noticed a letter in his hand. "Bad news?" she asked. Eli hesitated, then shook his head. "Not bad. Just unexpected. Looks like I got family coming. A niece I've never met." The brunette's eyes lit with curiosity. "That could be good for you. Someone new to share the ranch with." Eli gave a non-committal grunt, but inside he felt a tangle of emotions. Uncertainty, a flicker of hope, and a pinch of unease. He'd built a life of solitude for so long, and now it seemed the world was determined to break it open. Over the next days, the women kept coming by to help with chores, but they also noticed Eli preparing in small ways he didn't mention out loud. He repaired the spare bedroom in his house, replaced the worn blankets, even built a small writing desk from scrap lumber. It was the first time in years he'd worked on something meant for someone else. One evening, as the sun dipped low and the prairie turned gold, the blonde spoke gently while helping him feed the cattle. "You know, Eli, maybe this is exactly what you need. A fresh start doesn't always come the way we expect." Eli didn't answer right away, but he looked out over his land. The rolling pastures, the barn, the herd grazing peacefully. For the first time in 17 years, his world felt like it was shifting, piece by piece, towards something new. And though he wouldn't say it aloud, he was starting to wonder if that change might not be such a bad thing after all. The morning Eli McGraw's niece was due to arrive, the air over Dry Creek was crisp and bright. The prairie stretched wide and open under a pale blue sky, and the only sound was the creak of the barn doors as Eli started his chores. He had been up since before dawn, making sure everything on the ranch looked its best. The spare room was tidy, the floors swept, and a fresh quilt, stitched by one of the women, lay neatly folded at the foot of the bed. Around mid-morning, the familiar rumble of wagon wheels drifted over the dirt road. Eli stepped out onto the porch and saw a stagecoach in the distance, kicking up a trail of dust. Standing beside him were the three women, who had insisted on being there to welcome Clara. The coach slowed to a stop in front of the house, and the driver helped down a young woman of about 19. She had her mother's eyes, calm but searching, and wore a travel-worn dress with a satchel slung over one shoulder. "You must be Uncle Eli," she said, her voice soft but steady. Eli gave a slow nod. "And you must be Clara." There was an awkward moment where neither quite knew what to say, but then Clara smiled, and it eased something in him. He took her bag without another word and motioned toward the house. "Come on, you've had a long trip." Inside, Clara looked around with quiet appreciation. "It's cozy. I wasn't sure what to expect." Over the next few days, she settled into ranch life quickly. She learned to feed the cattle, mend simple fence breaks, and even milk Bessie with only a little guidance. The three women helped her adjust, often working alongside her while Eli watched from a distance. Noting how easily she fit into the rhythm of the place one afternoon, while repairing a section of fence together, Clara spoke without looking up. "Ma said you were a good man, even if you like to keep to yourself. I think she's right. You've taken care of this land, and it looks like you've got good friends too." Eli didn't answer right away. Compliments weren't something he knew how to handle, but her words warmed him more than he expected. As summer stretched on, the ranch no longer felt like a quiet, lonely outpost. It was filled with voices, Clara's laughter, the women's friendly banter, and even Eli's deep chuckle from time to time. He found himself looking forward to each day, to the work and the company alike. One evening, as the sun sank behind the hills, the group sat together on the porch, sipping coffee and watching the cattle graze in the golden light. The air was still, the sky painted in streaks of orange and pink. Eli leaned back in his chair, a rare smile on his face. 17 years of solitude had kept him safe, but it had also kept him closed off from everything that made life worth living. Now, with Clara and his unlikely trio of friends by his side, the ranch no longer felt like just a place to work. It felt like home. And for the first time in nearly 2 decades, Eli McGraw knew he wasn't just a giant loner of Dry Creek anymore. He was part of something again.